The basic psychological model of doing mode versus being mode is very familiar in mindfulness circles, and quite possibly it's familiar to us outside of these circles as well. It's fairly self-explanatory. It's nice and simple, and it is a good model. But the problem is we need to be very careful in using it. So I was saying earlier that if we could understand this dichotomy of being mode versus doing mode, that would steer us in the direction of having a better understanding of anxiety. And the proviso is that we don't use this dichotomy as a model in the normal sense, because when we talk about being mode, we don't want to think about it. We don't want to think, being mode, which is of course what we do. Of course we do that. Even for me to sit here and talk about it, I'm thinking, being mode. It's like a thought bubble above my head. Now that creates a glitch, because when I think about being mode, that's actually thinking mode. Thinking's a doing, so it's actually doing mode. I'm doing something, I'm thinking about my being. If I'm thinking about being, I'm in doing mode, absolutely. So if I'm thinking about being, I'm thinking. It doesn't matter what I think about. I could think about anything at all. The subject of my thinking doesn't alter the fact that I am thinking, so I'm in thinking mode. This is a big deal, really. If I happen to be a theologian and I go around thinking about God all day long, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep, I'm thinking about God. Most people would say, wow, that dude's a pretty religious guy, he doesn't think about anything else. He doesn't think about all the other stuff we think about. He only thinks about God. He must be pretty righteous, pretty holy. But as at least one Christian mystic has said, to think about God is irreligious. To think about God is actually to deny God. Because when I'm thinking about God, I can have no connection with God. Now, I don't want this to turn into a religious argument, because it's likely to alienate a lot of people who don't want to be thinking in terms of God, due to the fact, no doubt, that they've been beaten over the head by it, by other people who think it's good to talk about God and think about God, and which is really nothing to do with God or the divine, if we could put it like that, the ineffable. Because the thing about the ineffable is that it's totally ineffable. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. We can't name it, we can't see it, we can't smell it, we can't theorize it, or anything like that. And instead of the ineffable or the divine, we can equivalently talk about being mode. So being mode is something that we lose really quickly. It's like trying to hold an eel. If you ever had a live eel and you try to hold it, you'll know that that's kind of difficult. Pretty damn hard to keep hold of that eel. So being mode is like that. We think we've got it, but we don't. We're just in thinking mode, and we're glorifying our thinking mode by thinking we're thinking about being, which is special. So our thinking must be special. Only that's not true. Just as a religious person who thinks about God is really glorifying their own thinking, because the assumption is that because I'm thinking about God, this is special thoughts, these are special thoughts. This is a special type of thinking. It's godly thinking. Don't bug me, man. Can't you see I'm involved in godly thinking, not just mundane thinking such as most people indulge in? So, having said that, having spelled out the reason for us to be very delicate and very cautious when we're using this dichotomy, and don't just think we understand it and race on ahead, because if we do that, we're not really racing anywhere. We're just doing what we always do and going around in circles in the realm of thought. And we don't want to do that because we do it all the time and it's no help and it's no fun. We're like a blue bottle buzzing around a dusty, airless room, banging its head on the window over and over again, trying to get out. The blue bottle knows that there's something outside of the window. It can see it, or it knows it in some way. I don't know how it knows it, but it knows it. But it can't get out there because it doesn't understand, I suppose, the way to leave a room is through an open window or a door. Obviously, it hasn't got that conceptual framework to help it. So, with that proviso in mind, the next stage of our argument, if it is an argument, is to say that we also have to be very careful and not jump to any conclusions about who it is who wants to be not anxious. The me that doesn't want to be anxious, the self that doesn't want to be anxious. We have to understand what the self is, what the everyday sense of self is. Now again, we all assume we know that and we race on ahead, but we don't know it. We're in too much of a hurry to think we know things when we don't. So it's worth spending a bit of time just looking a bit more clearly about who is this person that wants to stop being anxious? Who am I who is being anxious? Who is the anxiety sufferer? And the first thing that we can say is that the everyday sense of self is a doing. It's not a being, it's a doing. It can't be a being because being doesn't have any lines drawn around it. Being doesn't come with any limitations, with any boundaries. You can't have being versus something else, or being chopped up nicely and put into compartments. That's not the way being works. It's not the way being works because once we talk about being divided into compartments, that's actually being when it is being subjugated by doing. The doing being the slicing it up and putting it in compartments, which is the operation of the thinking mind. So in a flash, the thinking mind takes the dominant position and carries on pretending that it gives a damn about anything other than its own bureaucracy, which it doesn't. So the everyday sense of self is a doing, which means it's predicated upon control, which straight away shows us where the anxiety comes from. Because if my very idea of myself, the idea of myself I base everything on, is founded upon control. In other words, I have to keep on controlling in order to keep that end concept viable. Well, there we have anxiety right there, because what happens if I stop controlling? I might slip up. I might forget. I might take my eye off the ball. I could just get lazy and fail to do my duty of controlling things so that there seems to be a self for me to believe in. And it's not as if we think this out explicitly, and it's not as if we think if I stop controlling, something very bad is going to happen. It doesn't exist on an explicit level. It's just a deep down fear that doesn't find articulation, really. We don't ever try to put any words to it. But the point is that we do know in inverted commas, that if we stop controlling, that is a very bad outcome, the very worst outcome ever from the point of view of the extrinsic self. In other words, the extrinsic self is the self who we are programmed to be. It's a self that's made out of boundaries and divisions and compartments and categories, and it comes from the outside. That's what we're programmed to be. Hence extrinsic. It's extrinsic to us. We could also go on talking about the intrinsic self, which is the self that comes from within. That is the self who we actually are, that we haven't been programmed to believe, and that's fine, as long as we are careful with the word self and don't get to thinking that it is bounded in any way or that it's special to me. Because if I say, well, the intrinsic self is special to me, who is this me? Because the me that I'm trying to say it's special to is the extrinsic self, the self that I routinely take myself to be. So in other words, the intrinsic self is a kind of a stranger we very rarely meet. It could be said that it is the true self, and a lot of people use that type of terminology, which I'm reluctant to use. But of course, I can understand what they mean. But there is this proprietorial tone to it all. My true self, my true self, my true self, my true self, whatever way you want to put the emphasis. Whereas the practical fact of the matter is that it's not mine, because it doesn't belong to anybody. It is other. So the intrinsic self is other. I'm always looking at everything from the point of view of the extrinsic self. And the intrinsic self is other. It's got nothing to do with the extrinsic self. It's not under its control. It's not under its remit. It is like a stranger sitting over there. It's not me. It's got nothing to do with me. It's a complete stranger. Couldn't be further away from me. Everything I am, it's not, and vice versa. I am petty-minded and obsessed with details and pretty miserable. The intrinsic self, if we use that word a bit longer, is none of those things. It's like someone I catch a glimpse of. But it surely ain't me. But it is who I am, because everything is other. Everything is other. Everything real is other. But the world of our common experience is made up of the not other, the claustrophobic world of our own thoughts, which we can't escape from. So this allows us to see, because the self is a doing, and not only that it's a doing that can't admit to itself that it's a doing that has to kid itself that it was there all along, which is the key thing. That thought does, according to David Bohm. It reveals categories or divisions, as David Bohm says, and swears blind that they were all there all along. Thought says, they were there all along, I didn't make them up. Honest, cross my heart. But of course, thought did make them up, because wherever there's divisions, you can be sure that thought made them up. It's as simple as that. So, thought makes divisions. Thought makes the everyday sense of self. Thought makes the intrinsic self. And it neatly conceals from itself the fact that it is doing this. So we can't be directly aware of this thought process whereby I think, oh my gosh, I'm only here because I control it so that I'm here, or because I arrange it so I'm here. Therefore, I must never stop controlling. because we don't know we're controlling, so we can't have that thought process. But so what we have is underground anxiety, which is no less for being underground. In fact, it's a hell of a lot more. It's a hell of a lot more ominous, because we know it's super bad, but we don't know why. We don't know what it spells. But it's just so bad, that doesn't seem to matter. It just becomes the ultimate catastrophe that we can't even bear to think of. So obviously we can't work with that ultimate catastrophe. We just feel it looming, and then we do our best to kind of get rid of that looming awareness as quickly as we can. And what happens is that rather than perceiving the anxiety where it belongs, we think it's about something else. We think it's about something extrinsic. So it could be about things going wrong in the outside world, or things going wrong for me, all of which can be worthy. If I thought of anxiety, if I thought some great catastrophe was about to befall the world, which maybe it is, that's a pretty major source of anxiety. No one can say to us, don't worry, that's no big deal. Because that kind of catastrophe, most of us would agree, is a big deal. But the point is that still isn't what we're anxious about. It's still a projection. It's still an externalization. It's not the real deal, because the closed apparatus of thought doesn't allow us to see the real deal. And the real deal in anxiety is always the same. It comes out of the denied awareness that I myself am responsible for this continued perception of who I think I am, of who I perceive myself to be. It comes out of me taking responsibility for what I shouldn't take responsibility for. Whenever we take responsibility for something very, very big that actually we wouldn't have a clue about anyway, that's the recipe for anxiety. Whatever you do, don't take responsibility for some colossal, huge thing that is none of your business anyway. Not that we have much choice in taking responsibility for it, because that's how neurosis works. We start taking on responsibility for stuff that we shouldn't do. And then if we meet a therapist, they tell us to take responsibility for our taking too much responsibility. And so it becomes our responsibility to do something about our neurosis, to do something about our pattern of taking on too much responsibility. And that's not really going to work, is it? The reason we come up with therapies like that is because we don't understand this dichotomy of being mode versus doing mode. We still think everything has to be about doing mode. So if being in doing mode the whole time produces this state of anxiety that I can never be free of, even though I can escape temporarily perhaps, when it happens that I can't escape anymore and it's actually attacking me, further application of doing mode is not really going to help at all. I'm using the same thing to fix the problem that created the problem in the first place. And that's the one thing we can never see when we're in doing mode. Our vision is just too constrained. We've got too much tunnel vision going on. We'll keep on battering ourselves against that wall forever. We'll be continually oblivious to the paradox, because we don't get paradoxes. Thought, the nature of thought is that it can never see a paradox. In order to see a paradox, it's a bit like seeing a joke. It's a lot like seeing a joke. If we're too rational, we won't see a joke. We'll just have this blank look on our face, and we'll be thinking, why did he say that? Or, it's just a funny thing to say. And everyone else will say, it's okay, he didn't get it, don't worry, he never gets the joke. gets too much in his own head. Exactly the same with paradoxes. We're just totally blank. There's a paradox and we're just looking at it blank. We never really notice. What the paradox is, it's a way of discovering that doing will never ever work for us in psychological terms, because every doing turns into a paradox instantaneously. In other words, it rebounds on us, our efforts rebound on us to make the situation doubly bad. If I say something's not an issue, say it's not an issue, it's not an issue, I'm making it more of an issue. If I say I don't care, like an archetypal teenager, I'm making it obvious to everyone that I totally do care, etc., etc. So being mode, even though I don't want to get analytic about it and try and think about it, is such a very different kettle of fish to doing mode. So if we understand that doing mode is all about controlling without knowing that we're controlling, in other words, we're totally micromanaging everything in a futile way, because ultimately our micromanaging doesn't produce what we want it to produce, which is the real self, an actual real or independently existing self. It doesn't do that. It just produces us with a temporary illusion of that thing, the extrinsic self. So that's a pretty hideous way of spending our lives, really. We live our lives, but at the same time we have to do this ridiculous thing whereby we kind of pretend to ourselves that we are this extrinsic self, when even when we do succeed in pretending or fooling ourselves, we still don't have a lot of fun, because we're living life on the basis of some arbitrary notion that has no connection with anything real anyway. So even when it works well, it doesn't do us any good. So this gives us a kind of a way, at least, of talking about being mode, and that is to say that being mode is when we're completely spontaneous and completely unself-conscious, because then we have genuine existence, so to speak. We have being, but we just can't prove it, or we just can't know it. Okay, thanks for watching.